Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar in partnership with the IMI's European Health Data Evidence Network, EHDEN. My name is Dwayne Schultes, and I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation. And today we're going to be discussing determining value for patients and harnessing real-world evidence. Again, thank you very much for being with us. Now, before we get started, if you're having connectivity issues, problems, bandwidth issues, please feel free to use the phone. We've provided several dozen phone numbers. Just push the little arrow next to the mute button in your control panel. This menu will pop up and you can switch to one of the several dozen phone numbers we've provided for you in the context of this webinar. As well, if you would like to ask a question, we do want your questions. We've had several hundred of you register today. Please use the question bar again in your control panel, submit your question. We'll be sure to filter them through to the panel while we move through the webinar, and we'll be trying to get your questions answered as they come in. So again, thank you for your participation, and we're very grateful to have you here today. So with the growing use of regulatory tools such as conditional approvals and breakthrough designations, the traditional bottleneck of regulatory approval is seen as far less problematic today than it was previously. However, the early assessment of new products is also increasingly accompanied by smaller data sets that are often extrapolated for outcomes and survival. This creates enormous challenges for Europe's HTA bodies, which often need to assess these new treatments based on limited quantities of long-term outcomes data. This session will provide how EHDEN can function as a platform to capture longer-term outcomes data and provide alternative assessments to facilitate comparative effective measures and confirm the value proposition for patients. And I'm extremely pleased today to be joined by an exceptional panel of people. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Gojda Sazulu Briggs from Data Saves Lives. She's the coordinator of that project, as well as the European Patients Forum. Gojda, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to it.
It's our pleasure. We're also joined by Anja Schiel, who's the Senior Advisor and Statistician for the Norwegian Medicines Agency, also involved in the comp of the EMA. Hello, Anja. How are you?
Hi, Dwayne. Quite well. As always, looking forward to a hefty discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anja. We're also joined by Slavko Jambazov, who's the founder and managing director of HTA Limited. That's a consultancy focused on Central and Eastern Europe. Slavko, thank you for joining us, sir.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. Pleasure.
Thank you. Also, Nicholas Hedberg from the European Network for Health Technology Assessment, UNETA. He's their chair, as well as TLV in Sweden. Hello, Nicholas. How are you, sir?
Hello, I'm fine. I'm happy to be here and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Nicholas, and always happy to be enthusiastic. Fabulous, Nicholas. Thank you. And Jacqueline Bouvy from National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. Nice. Jacqueline, thank you. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this webinar.
Our pleasure. So to begin, firstly, Jackie, I'm going to come to you because you're currently working within EHDEN. You're a work package lead. And obviously NICE has been very, very active in setting a lot of the mechanisms and looking at a lot of the tools that are available with real world evidence. Can you give us an overview of your current activity within EHDEN and how it plays with your role within NICE?
Yeah, so EHDEN is the, as you can see in Dwayne's background, the European Health Data and Evidence Network. It's a 5-year public-private partnership that is establishing a federated network of data sources in Europe that are all standardized to the same common data model. And I co-lead Work Package 2 on outcomes-driven healthcare. And what we're exploring in Work Package 2 is whether this common data model that EHDEN is implementing, which is the OMAP common data model, which has been developed for research purposes initially, and with an initial focus on pharmacoepidemiology and drug safety studies. So we know that just fantastically well in generating very rapid evidence for those types of purposes. What we're trying to establish within EHDEN and the work package that I co-lead is how we can also use the same network and the same common data models to also generate data and evidence that is relevant in HTA settings. And it's interesting because the key difference, I think, is that HTA bodies tend to be interested in similar but also different evidence than regulators. But there already is a lot of established use of real-world evidence in the HTA settings, especially when we look at resource use or long-term outcomes and following patients and long-term outcomes in healthcare settings. So I'm really pleased to hear what other people think about the potential of using federated network studies for generating HTA relevant evidence.
Thanks, Jackie. And there's obviously a few questions I'd like to ask, but we're going to move through and let everybody else introduce themselves first and give their position on the issue. So, Nicholas, from your perspective, obviously you wear two hats. You have TLV in Sweden, as well as UNETA. Can you give us sort of the flavor of both organizations with regards to real-world evidence and observational data, please?
I'll do my best, and I'll try to. So I will refer to a brand new report that we published from TLV. That's where I start, only 2 weeks ago. And don't stay up at night, but the English version, the English translation will be coming up very soon. Stay sure. But there we've actually gone back and said that we now need to structure this. And although most of our readers will know this, we need to start with building the framework. So different kinds of data. So how is this product used? One. Then which effectiveness can it bring? So we need to establish that once again. We need to look at both which are the possibilities to find outpatient information about outpatient drugs, and as well as inpatient drugs. I guess this is the bread and butter for most of you, but that's where we've started. And then we worked ourselves through reasonings about coverage and the importance of high coverage, but also the important link between, if it's possible, from patient journals into national health databases and quality registries, to land up in a number of pilots we have described. And the bottom line is that we need now, given this framework, we need to focus on the methods, because how and when real world evidence can be claimed and can be used for an HTA body, the jury's still out on that one. We know and we can relate to real world data, but when do we come to real world evidence, and which are the methods we use there? I think HTA bodies are different in that aspect, but are all very aware that these data come to them. And giving a short flavor of the European side, I mean, from UNETA side, we have a number of methodological guidelines. For example, if you're looking into an indirect comparison, this is how you should do it. But how to use and when to use real world data sets, that will be more up to the national authorities still. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you getting consensus among the countries, or is it still pretty wide? I mean, again, I don't want dirty laundry here, but just how much variability is there right now, Nicholas?
I mean, obviously we have consensus on the methodological side, but on the usage side, there is still a lot of, I mean, and that's also how European Union is set up. That is a national decision making. So there is certainly more to do. And I personally think more will be done because of the increasing number of data sets that you talked about that are coming into us.
That's great, thank you. Now, you mentioned methods as one of your criteria in your research report, and that's obviously important. Anya obviously is a methodologist, a statistician, also consults the EMA. So Anya, from your perspective regarding the use of data, as well as the data sets and the methodologies around this, what do we need to do to make this practical from your perspective?
Well, I would start with that I have the feeling there's a certain perception that the European regulators and possibly also the HTAs are not embracing the use of real-world data to the extent they should. And I would like to highlight that this is a perception. And as always, as any of these perceptions, such a statement needs to be scrutinized and verified, because I think it's not really true. The European system has maybe a more liberal mandate than compared to the FDA when it comes to the use of real world data, because there is no equivalent to the 21st Century Cure Act here in Europe. But for those that are a bit more familiar with the system, we do have the EMA Regulatory Science Strategy to 2025 document, and a matching HMA European Medicines Agency Network Strategy to 2025. And they both highlight the wish to enable the system to use high quality real world data and developing the network competency and create tools to aid the use of such data. So it's not like there is no embracement. We are a bit more cautious, I think. And that is because our position is probably mainly driven by the actual capability of real world data to answer relevant questions for decision makers, rather than being driven by this wish to simply use real world data. So our focus is on any discussion around this topic has to be on the ability of the evidence that can be generated within these real world data sources to be used by the different stakeholders. So is it fit for purpose? Is it possibly even better than any other evidence that we are using? But at the same time, does such data reduce the uncertainty for different stakeholders, or does it actually increase it? And that is a crucial part of it, because sometimes people just want to ignore this aspect. So at all times, we need to simply accept that we should aim for the best possible and most robust evidence, not for the minimum or the attractive way to generate any evidence. And I think here the stakeholders have very different expectations and requirements. And the only way forward is to provide solid proof that some of the methodological shortcomings that have been highlighted in many webinars and in many publications are overcome. And in principle, I would say as a methodologist, I'm less concerned about the methods. I'm mostly concerned about the data quality and why the methods are not working. And that is where we have to move forward. So the proof is, as always, in the pudding. If you bring a brilliant example, then the acceptance will automatically increase. But as I say, the system is ready and willing. We are just a bit more cautious, and that is a luxury position we have here in Europe, I guess.
That's great, Anja. Thank you. Well, you brought up a lot of good points, and we'll bring those up for group discussion. I do definitely want to bring those back. Slaveko, from your perspective, you're working in Eastern Europe, you're consulting a lot of the Eastern European HTAs. You've got a slide here. Let me bring that up quickly. Bear with me for a second, if you would. There we go. Fabulous. Thank you. If you could just walk us through this, that would be very helpful, please. Thank you, Slaveko. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. So in Central Western Europe, usually there is no framework, and we usually count on inpatient data. There are few healthcare professionals, few healthcare facilities which can provide outpatient data. Most of it is administrative data, although there are some very good exceptions and examples for outcome data. So the availability is scarce, and then the access is not so easy. But once you get to the data, you need a lot of work. Sometimes we've done work with going patient by patient analysis, collecting, linking, cross-linking, integrating to get a decent analysis. At the same time, HTA bodies, some of the HTA bodies, they require real-world evidence, real-world effectiveness data, especially for orphan drugs, which are accepted with a phase 2 trials, for example, or with a doubtful cost-effectiveness data medicines, which are included into the reimbursement list. And it gets the job done for the companies, but handling the complexity of analyzing this data is not so easy. We still struggle with this. We try to use the international methodologies, but sometimes we get into real tough academic conversations. Let's put it this way. On the other hand, the risk-sharing agreements in Central Eastern Europe are mostly financial based, and with the upcoming personalized medicine, with the NTRK inhibitors, with the foundation medicine, the diagnostic next generation sequencing, with gene therapies, we're going to need more and more performance-based risk-sharing agreements just to get the right pricing for our markets. The pricing is completely different. The economic reality is completely different for Central Eastern Europe. So that's why we need local risk-sharing agreements. The potential for leapfrogging in our region for me is getting outcome and patient-related outcomes data from the very beginning, while introducing the e-health platforms. We're still not exactly there.
Thank you, Slovakia. You mentioned you say there's technical challenge. There's a challenge to using real-world evidence in Eastern Europe. Are the challenges mostly technical or political? I mean, where's the barrier? Both.
Well, the technical challenges are easily, you can easily overcome them. There are a lot of well-prepared IT people here that we can work with, but the political challenges are tougher than the technical ones.
Yeah, it's often the case. A lot of head shaking here too, I see on the panelists. Thank you, Slovakia. We'll obviously, there's a lot of questions we'd like to ask. We're going to move forward. And finally, I think what's really key here is all this should be for the patient perspective. How do we actually get better medicines quicker with better evidence to patients? And Gojda, from your perspective, obviously you're working at several sort of pain points here in Europe on several projects, both from Data Saves Lives as well as within Eden, but also at the European Patient Forum. How do these different perspectives unite, and what's your position related to real world evidence at European Patient Forum?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, for us, our members are the backbone of our work at European Patients Forum, and the perspectives bring the irreplaceable added value to our policy and advocacy activities. And our projects actually support all the work we do nowadays, more on digital and health-related projects as well. I mean, we currently have 75 patient organizations and 19 countries within Europe and 150 million patients across Europe. So for EPF, of course, it's fundamental for patients to be involved, as we always say, from the beginning. So what does that really mean, being from the beginning? It means from at every level, from shaping the real world evidence, the whole ecosystem. Patients should be there from the beginning, because in the end, it impacts their life and their expectations from the outcomes. So it's very important to co-create the information and the data together. So for us, patient groups should indeed be enabled and empowered to play a bigger role, because empowerment, I say, because they first need to understand what they can do, what they can achieve, where they can really step in, and where they will have to be observers on certain levels. So it's very fundamental role in creation of the real world evidence for us, in particular to capture the outcomes that's really matters to patients, and how to do it, including collection methods, of course, and ensuring the adaptation of transparent and clear informed consent mechanisms. These are key. And more robust data sets, of course, which can be built through patient inputs, can be beneficial to the decision-making as they increase the reliability of the outcomes. This is particularly true, for example, when it comes to making marketing authorizations of new treatments and HTA. So the same applies to define the right framework at the decision-making. Collecting the right data is only one piece of the puzzle. So patients should have a say on how it's safely stored, used and analyzed to ultimately concretely improve their health. So within this framework, we also at EPF are a secretariat of Data Saves Lives for the very reason, because we would like patient groups to play a fundamental role in providing access to reliable and unbiased information about real world data and evidence, while advocating accessible and understandable knowledge about the importance of data, health, and beyond. So as mentioned, it's the Data Saves Lives initiative we think is fundamental, because it's not only about patients, it's also about the whole ecosystem around it, and it's the co-creation as a multi-stakeholder unit. So we believe that it will be a win-win for every party that's involved if we can co-create this infrastructure together. So thank you.
Thank you, Gojda. When you say co-create, what specifically, practically would you want to do? I mean, if you could, when you say co-create.
Co-create is actually create the environment together. So because it's the very important thing is creating the environment where a patient can feel comfortable to actually participate and be part of, understand exactly the core expectations from them, core outcomes if they were part of it, and actually the whole process around it. So co-creation already at this point where we are is co-create means create the environment together. so that everybody feels comfortable, like feel home in that environment. That's what I mean.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank our audience that's out there. We are taking questions. It's a little quiet right now for questions. We certainly have plenty here we can do, but if the audience would like to ask a question, please use your Q&A bar. Submit the question. I will filter them out to the participants, and we very much look forward to having your input. So firstly, wow, there's a lot of things that came up here. I guess the one came up quite a few times: high quality real world evidence. This is a phrase that quite a few of you use, most of you used actually. How do we define high quality real world evidence? What are we saying when we say high quality RWE? Let me begin. I'll start with you, Anya. Let me start with you then, because you're sitting on the EMA side as well as other things. What are you looking for as an HTA when you say real world, high quality real world evidence?
I think actually we don't have a fixed definition. For me, it's rather...
That's why I'm asking the question.
I know, but for me, it's rather I need to understand the data. So I need to understand the shortcomings of a data source, because then I can make a conscious decision on whether I can use it to answer a certain question. There is no such thing as completely rubbish data. There is data that has obviously been collected for a very different purpose, and as such probably has a lot of missing aspects that I need to consider whether or not I can accept that these aspects are missing. But if I'm looking for quality of life data and they are not collected in a database, then it might be a brilliant, huge database that collects everything else perfectly, but it doesn't provide the necessary evidence that I'm looking for. That doesn't make it bad or good in the classical sense. But I think we can agree that if we could agree on core outcome sets that should always be collected by all databases, then we would have an easier time also combining data sets and then removing maybe some of the weaknesses of one data set by putting it into a larger context and being willing to extrapolate a little bit from one database to another, for example. But in essence, for me, the quality mainly means I need to fully understand the data. And that isn't an easy task to begin with. So that's where my quality definition comes from. And the quality is completely directly correlated to my question at hand. So even a very poor data set can still be sufficient for a certain question, while a brilliant one might not be sufficient for another question.
So from your perspective, you're looking at this from a use case. If the data answers the question suitably for the use that you're looking for, then you're okay. So you think the data set needs to be fit for purpose primarily. You're from a standpoint of status. That's what you're looking at. Okay, that's great. Thank you. That's very interesting. Nicholas, from your perspective, I mean, you have to put and implement this. How does that work? So data fit for purpose. How do you define fit for purpose from an UNETA perspective then?
I'll start closer to Anya, and to me, I would say that traditionally we have an image that a high quality data set shall have a large coverage, or hopefully a great, a sufficient power, a large group of patients, many data points. But for many indications and treatments, we have extremely small patient groups. They are a very heterogeneous group. So you will face tremendous challenges with any kind of data. Also, the RCT data will be of a different kind. So quality will have to be related to that. But if I can be, you know me, and we're among friends here, I can also be a bit provocative, and I think we need to grab hands with the patients here, and for some HTAs, and I think for some patients, there is always an underlying question, and that is then towards the companies. Do we get a large, attempt at least, sometimes a large data set with real world data here, because this is a way to bring better, or sometimes the only possible data set? Then that is one case. But is it that this is a way to bring cheaper and the absolute minimum required data set? Then that is another, the other side of that medal. And I think That is one reason why some HTAs are still very hesitant to go into this field. It's not really about quality.
Well, again, small is only as small as you don't get statistics, right? I mean, if you have it's the variance that kills a statistical model. And if you don't have variance and you see large effect size, you don't necessarily need huge populations. I mean, you can get good results. When I see enormous data sets and very small effect sizes, okay, that's why you need large numbers sometimes. But obviously, there's a conflict there because often HTA say, well, that data set isn't big enough, even if you come with good statistics. Jackie, you mentioned something about federated data, and this sort of the knock-on question from Nicholas was saying, there needs to be enough data there to do the result. If you look at an EHDEN database, that's a federated data set. And if you're dealing with small populations, do you have enough data there to be able to find a result if the fact that the calculations are being done locally? Is there enough there, as it were?
I suppose so. It's a good point, and I think that that's one of the main advantages that we see, and also one of the potential advantages of using a federated network, especially when you're looking at rare diseases and very small populations. That if you can combine data from lots of different sources, that's potentially a main advantage. But it does depend a bit on what the intended use is for using that data, and I think as well. When I hear Nicholas and Anja talk about these issues, it also depends really on what you want to do with real world evidence and how you want to use this. So if you want to use it for, characterizing a population and looking at baseline risk for certain events, for example, I think some uses are much less controversial than others. And I think the key controversial use is, will you be able to do comparative effectiveness based on real world data and real world evidence? And I think there, at least, in my opinion, maybe one day we'll have the tools and the methods to do that in a way that it can replace RCTs, but I don't think that we're there yet. And I think, if anything, the pandemic actually has shown that when it comes to reliable evidence and authoritative evidence on treatments, that we've seen that evidence has been coming from big trials rather than from the real world data sources. At the same time, we've seen some of the work that EHDEN has done in COVID-19, looking at small drug safety events, that they're having a federated network of data sources is a very rapid way of actually generating highly relevant evidence. But there are fundamentally different uses of data, and I think that that's a kind of a key difference in when we're talking about embracing real world evidence or being perhaps a bit more standoffish about all the potential uses that there are.
Are we at risk of limiting RWE just to safety studies? Is that a problem potentially? It's sort of, that's easy to do, we're comfortable there, so we're just happy to take those now, or not? Anja's shaking your head. I'd like to let others in, but Anja, please. I mean, you obviously.
No, I think it's just because we have a lot more experience with using this type of data for safety. And on the HTA side, we also have a lot of experience on finding utility values from this kind of data sources. But really just acknowledging the shortcomings of the data, but having poor data or maybe data with holes in it is still better than no data. But I know that Nicholas has a famous saying that about the quality of data. I'll leave it to him to repeat it to the audience, but I totally agree that at some point there's a limit to what data still can offer. I'm totally aligned with Jacqueline. I know what most people want. They want to replace the RCT, which is, to my opinion, the holy grail of the idea around real world evidence. But remember the story about the Holy Grail. And we're pretty much down that road. And I would say, let's be cautious and, start with the low-hanging fruits and improve by using good examples, low-hanging fruits, the purposes for which the data is more than suitable, and at the same time improve the quality, working towards this goal that maybe one day we actually might find, in contrast to others, this holy grail.
And is it the folklore Holy Grail or the Monty Python Holy Grail? I guess that's the question. Slaveko, I'll come to you. Yes, please.
I absolutely agree with Anya. If it answers the research question, it's good enough. But in Central Eastern Europe also, you have to know how you can validate this data. Because in a single payer system, sometimes the data is collected according to the requirements of the single payer. And the validation of the data is crucial to get a decent analysis.
Thank you, Slaveko. I mean, one other thing we see is there's a lot of concerns about how we best do patient-reported outcomes and data quality there. Gojda, from your perspective, what do we need to do for best practice in patient-reported outcomes? Because this is being asked for increasingly. How do we do it right?
Yeah, to do it right, actually, for them to first understand, you know, that here, listening to you, for example, for me already is, it's great. It's so much value, because it's like seeing the other side of the story is very important to understand what are the gaps, what are the needs actually for the people collecting this and doing the analysis and trying to collect the evidence. The key is knowing for patient side to understand what's going on behind the curtains as well. So I think that's the fundamental need. If we want patients to give also the quality data, I know it's not only at the patient's level that the quality changes, because I mean, there are a lot of processes after the patient actually provides the information or the data. But already at that level, if we could make them understand the processes, I think they would be more accurate in giving the data and more willing to actually contribute further if there are needs in between. It's not just one time, but it could be progressive and continuous. So I think that's one of the key things, is seeing what's behind the curtains for the patients and patient organizations is fundamental.
Thank you, Gojda. And sort of following up what Gojda just said, we have a question here from Evelyn Piper, who says, from the HTA perspective, from the panelist perspective, what's the role for patient-generated data going forward? Jackie, you've done a lot of research in this. What do you see as the role, the proper role for patient-reported data? What do we need?
It's a really good question. I suppose it depends a bit in what kind of context we're looking at this. So a lot of the data sources that we're exploring as part of EHDEN tend to be electronic health records, for example. And I think that there really is an increasing use in making sure that even in these types of data sources, the patient-reported outcomes, especially those that have been developed in collaboration with patients and people living with a certain condition, really enable you to get the best insight into how a condition affects patients, and also what outcomes matter the most to them. So there's a lot of interest. That's also something that we're looking at as part of EHDEN, is how we can use that data to enable a number of activities. So ICHOM, which is an organization that operates in this and also develops core outcome sets, is one of the partners in EHDEN and in Work Package 2, and we're trying to see how we can integrate those outcome sets as part of the EHDEN network and use them for different purposes.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Slaveko, from your perspective, what's the role of patient-reported data in Eastern Europe? Do you have one right now? Or are you trying to work that in? What's the status?
It's in a research mode. There are different specialties which work with the patient-related outcomes data. My colleagues and I, we personally are involved in such projects, but it's not widely available. You see, there is a Polish value set. There are other Central Eastern European countries which are currently developing their value sets. In Bulgaria, we have our own population norms, but no value sets yet. So I wouldn't say that it's something that really plays a huge role into the HTA locally.
Thank you, Slaveko. And Evelyn, thank you very much for your question. Again, we encourage all of you listening. There's over 100 of you out there. Please feel free to submit your questions. We'll get them out. Nigel Hughes, the project director, has submitted a question. Hello, Nigel. Thank you for your participation, as always, sir. There's a clear need to improve the data at source. This is obviously true. Has the panel specific views on how we can improve data and how it's achieved as a byproduct of clinical care? That's an interesting one. Nicholas, I'll come to you. So how do we actually leverage clinical care data and start bringing that in as RWE practically?
that is not my specific expertise, but a number of general lines, and I've already mentioned one. I think we need to make sure that we can find a link from patient journals to for example, quality registries, and I think we must, as far as possible, trust that the journals are filled in accurately. But if we can minimize the extra burden so that we can make sure that every data only needs to be inserted once by the clinician or yeah, the doctor or the nurse, that is one way to go. Make it easy to use and as less burdensome as possible. That would be my start. And we've mentioned a few in the report.
Thank you. And how can people get that report, Nicholas? Is it a publicly? You said it's in Swedish only right now?
Yes, but I can post the link in the questions and answer field, I guess.
Or if you can send it to us, and we'll send it out when we do the mailing afterwards. Thank you. No, it'd be great to get that out. Jacqueline, do you have any further comment on what Nicholas just said? No, that's fine.
I mean, just to add that it is going to be tricky, especially if it's as part of, and this is something I think we discussed on the podcast that we did on a similar topic a couple of weeks ago, especially as part of clinical care. If there is no real need for capturing certain outcomes, you can question whether it is going to be part of these types of data sources. But I suppose it really helps if there is a better and clearer communication about what the core outcomes are that really should be captured as part of clinical care as well.
And goes to real world capture, data capture. I know the European Patient Forum is heavily involved in that. Can you give us some examples of some projects you're working on to do real-time capture, or at least be involved in that in the development side?
Yeah, actually we have one very strong one right now. Actually, we're working very actively. It's a Digital Health Europe project as well. And it's basically, we are realizing we can't ask patients, that especially chronic disease patients, that all their lives, they're kind of, some of them are going through this disease, kind of take journals or notes of their own data, although they do. We're realizing the help of digital solutions actually facilitating their lives a lot. But again, coming to that, there is a lot at the background. It is not standard and it is not applicable for everybody, because we can start literacy is already digital literacy. I mean, you can't expect everybody to have the same level, even internet connection to that level. We are in Europe, but we could really talk about those details. So there are a lot of discrepancies, but we still believe that digital solutions are really helping patient groups, chronic disease patients, lives easier when it comes to having their data collected. Of course, if they can follow up on what happens with that data after and where it's being used, of course, would be the best scenario. But already so far, we are having great feedback from our members that actually that can use those digital solutions, increase their journals, digital journals of their health data tremendously. So we support it fully, but we know there are handicaps, there are issues still that we need to solve, and we have time. Yeah.
Thank you, Gojda. And Nigel, thank you for your question. We have a question here from Laurie Lambert. Can someone give an example of a real world evidence success story, and what were the keys to that success? Now, someone had mentioned, was it you, Jackie? You mentioned the EHDEN extraction on the hydroxychloroquine that was done. I'm not sure, do you know that study?
I wasn't involved in it personally, but many members of the EHDEN project were. So that was part of a study-a-thon that the Odyssey community, so Odyssey is the community that looks after the OMOP common data model. And they, I think in late March, organized a study-a-thon where they explored a number of research questions that were relevant for COVID-19. One of the things that they did is indeed looked at safety events for hydroxychloroquine, not in use in COVID, but in kind of established users. And I believe that they actually found a safety signal that was given serious consideration by regulatory agencies. Perhaps Anya's familiar with it, given her regulatory work.
Hunting to Anya. Anya, do you have any comment?
Yeah, well, I think on the hydrochloroquine, we actually had a press release or a document also on the EMA website on the safety issues. And in particular, we came out quite early about when the hydrochloroquine was widely used, you know, based on purely rumors and no data. Yes,
yeah, wisely used. Yes, we'll put that in quotes. Yes.
and at that time point, we actually kind of pointed out that, you know, no drug is without risks, and you shouldn't just use anything under the assumption that because it is approved, it doesn't have any risks. And in particular, in off-label use, these risks are not absolutely clear. So yes, I think the COVID situation in principle is showing us that all our shortcomings, but also all the potentials of where you can really show that good use of real world evidence is something that could be of extreme value. In essence, what underlies it is always more or less that anything where you have only been looking at real world data and you make analysis in that one data source are really good uses. While anytime you try to mix the two worlds, the artificial RCT with the real world evidence, you run into huge problems. And that is also coming back to the comment from Nigel about the collection in the clinical setting versus the RCT. Well, it's two completely different situations in which you are trying to collect data. And I think the real proof would be if we could show patients that this collection, and physicians in addition, that going an extra mile and collecting this type of data made in the end a difference, either because something was approved because of it or it was reimbursed because of it. And I think Nicholas will agree, there's many times it is approved because of this data, and maybe we are not really good enough in conveying this message also to the patients, that this was instrumental for reimbursement decisions, for example. So, but as always, keep it separate. You know, do the right question in the right data source and exclusively in that data source, and you're not having problems. And COVID is showing us that we have an enormous amount of data, and every methodologist and statistician is completely frustrated by our inability to do something with this enormous amount of data that is there. And that's where we really have to learn from this situation and work towards the correct use of this information.
Yes, and just following up something Jackie said about the study-a-thon, we did a podcast with Kees van Bachova from the Hive, who was involved in that, and he outlines in the podcast very eloquently how they managed to pull a study together on hydroxychloroquine within about 4 days. And so it's quite impressive how the platform can be used and motivated. And Laurie Lambert, thank you very much for your question. There's an increasing challenge we see in that there's a sort of pull between the regulatory and the HTA. Regulators are often willing to take some of the evidence quickly, but then we're having what's called the efficacy effectiveness gap, where we're seeing we can't really prove if something is working from an effectiveness standpoint. How can a platform like EHDEN, and I should credit Hans-Georg Eichler, Dr. Hans-Georg Eichler, the EMA, that's sort of his, what he calls the efficacy effectiveness gap. How can EHDEN play with this, or at least help solve this gulf that emerges between the efficacy effectiveness gap? Nicholas, I'll come to you. How do you see this problem evolving, and what can EHDEN, how would you want to use EHDEN if you could with UNETA, for example?
Well, I don't know if EHDEN can make up for the different needs we have, because we the one judgment is risk benefit and the other one is net benefit or cost effectiveness, even especially for some of us. But I come back to what Anja was telling you. I would say when you have to make a decision, then a little data is better than no data. Even some data is better than no data. But any data isn't better than no data. And for HTAs, much of the work is to make sure we know the difference between n and some. Some and any, sorry, some and any. And I think EHDEN can provide us with a lot of data on a number of products with a little data, and especially help us to decide the difference between any and some. Okay, here we have some data. It is structured. It is collected in a similar way. It can even be reproduced because we know where it came from, how it was done. And then I dearly think that we can have more of some data and less of any data.
Is it a question of any and some, or is it a question of any and enough? You know, and it seems to me increasingly a lot of the problem is how much is enough. Because some people, you know, you can get a statistical answer using real world evidence, and then people say, oh, well, we need 200 more patients or 400 more patients. Is it the question of the methodology and when you determine what is enough? Is it more that? Anya's shaking her head no, so she doesn't agree.
But I'll break in there and start. It's also a matter of how do we today find agreements about our new decision and our agreement about the new decision when we have these new 200 patients or 400 or 40. So the number of patients is less important than we must now agree that in 5 years' time we reconvene, and given that the data looks like great, we come to this new conclusion. If it looks like very uncertain, we come to this conclusion, and when it looks like rubbish, we come to that conclusion, because we will always fight each other's with bad data quality when we come to that point if we haven't had an agreement on at the start.
Anya, I'm going to come back to you. Sorry. What's your opinion? You're shaking your head, so I'm just curious. What do you? Is it some enough? What's right? What's wrong? Where do you position this?
Okay, so let's start with a simple statement. Moses didn't come down from the mountain and had an extra tablet that said, you shall test everything at a 5% alpha level. That is an agreement we have. And that comes back to what Niklas is saying. We have to have an agreement, and in some situations, these numbers we are also fixed on are off the table. We have to rediscuss what is enough. And if you have an enormous effect, then 10 patients is a robust data set from both perspectives. So even the clinicians would say, well, you know, if you see this in a situation where you never ever have seen any response, we agree that this is robust enough, and we can make clear decision based on that information. And it doesn't even have to be statistically significant, because it's a parachute situation everybody's talking about.
Right.
It's the in-between. You know, you have complete rubbish, no discussion there. You have super excellent. And in the middle, there is something where we need some flexibility. And the miracle word is always agility. And before agility, we had adaptive, because that is what it is, what Niklas is describing. We cannot make decisions based in time on one single point in time on one single data set anymore. We have to understand that this is a continuous process. Some evidence is generated later. What we don't really have is a framework on what happens when the outcomes are not what we expect. We tend to simply say something like we need more data. But what we don't say is we expect, based on your current proposal, that you will show us an effect size of this delta with this kind of confidence interval around it. And if you can't, then there will be consequences. And if you can, there will be other consequences. That is a step we need to make, and we haven't done that. We are just vaguely saying we want more data, which is for any statistician something where we tell people why, and explain to me what you expect to get out of it. Because when you ask them, then they probably tell you something, and you're saying, well, then 200 patients will not do. You need 20,000. Are you going to ask for that? And then they realize, oh, no, that's unrealistic to ask for that. So you have to really think it through. And we haven't been thinking through. We just always call this, well, we want more. Well, it's not true. More is not necessarily better.
And you and I recently had a situation where evidence was presented and it was conclusive, and we got the more answer. So this does have, I mean, and there's an example where there was an effect size. It's like, hey, no, what, more? Okay, why? And well, because, you know, we will it. Okay, great. So yes, this is exactly the problem. Slovaco, from your perspective, how are you dealing this in Eastern Europe? Are you getting the more, the some, the right? What sort of flavor are you looking for right now?
We're looking just not to get the any, we're really trying to get the sum. There are, of course, some cases where we get really good data, but it's usually the exception. So it's more of a matter of making decisions and getting patient access. So I agree with Anya. You take the decision and then you follow for a certain period of time, and we expect that there will be new negotiations, but still we are in the starting point.
That's great, Slaveko. We've got a question here from Jos Arts, and this is a question for Jacqueline. EHRs are notoriously problematic for patient-generated data because of the lack of data standardization, incomplete and missing data, etc. How do you, as an HTA in EHDEN, deal with that? So, Jacqueline, how are you dealing with missing data and data quality coming out of an EHR?
Well, one of the great things about EHDEN is that it's a really good point. One of the great things about EHDEN and using a common data model is that standardizes the local data sources. So if there are regional differences in definitions that are being used within different data sets, it allows you to standardize data and translate it and have it all in the same vocabularies. But what that does mean is that there can be information loss in that step as well, or there can be differences in how that, so we call it mapping, how that is actually being done. But it is one of the ways in which we hope to overcome some of those challenges, because, but what it can't fix, so if you have a common data model, like it can't fix issues with the source data. So if there is a lot of missing data there, that is not a problem that you can address using a common data model approach.
Sure, thank you very much. We have another question here, and thank you, Jos, for your question. This is from Yannick Kapper. Will there be a tool where patients can monitor who and why has used their data and what was the result? So sort of data transparency. Gojda, from your perspective, what are we working on for data transparency? And this is from Yannick Kapper. Thank you, Yannick. Gojda, what's working on from a transparency side?
I wouldn't be able to tell the work that's been going on so far, actually. What we have been involved and our members have been involved. The transparency, it's only can happen mutually. So if there is enough feedback and regular feedback between the parties, and even if it's in a digital solution, if you know exactly where the structure is, and you can actually get feedback and talk to the system, so it doesn't look like a robot or just like something that's there to suck your data and then give you nothing back, then there is always mutual agreement or kind of motivation to do from the patient side. So there are, I know, a lot of work going on. We are not particularly involved as EPF in these researches and the work being done on the digital environment, but we hear from our members that they have been invited to participate, which makes us very happy that actually they are involved from the beginning, so that they could actually explain what would make them more motivated to actually be part of it or involve or use the app or whatever digital solution it is. So that's more or less where we are. Of course, we're closely monitoring, but we are not directly engaged with the digital solutions.
Sure, thank you. And Yannick, also, if you want to look at an example, there's the Estonian health data network that's completely blockchain and functional, and all the patients and anybody who's involved in the Estonia health system can control their health data and allow it to be used within criteria that they can set themselves, which is pretty interesting. This will have to be our last audience question. We're running out of time. This is from Krina Smargadentayan. Boy, I probably butchered that. Sorry about that, Krina. I hope that's okay. How can we improve the communication between patients, HCPs, and big companies to get the most out of real-world data? How do we improve the communications between patients, HCPs, healthcare professionals, and big companies to get the most from real-world data? Gosha, I'll start from you. How do we improve those relationships and interactions?
Wow, yeah, that's the $1 million question, I guess. I believe that it's a little bit like having too much data that you don't know where to start from. I think this is more or less it. It's to figuring out, is there only one way to actually put them together and engage them? I don't think so. And we think there are multiple ways actually to engage them. But more than what are the ways, it's what are the fundamentals around it. It's we go back to trust. So, and also knowledge. I mean, if the patients know where to go, who to go to, and if they can feel that they can trust that community and they don't look like aliens to them or they're strangers to them, then I think that's the key point, because if we're putting the patients in the center of it, then I think everything around it will start circulating and moving around it, because their data is going to be valuable for everybody and to the patient. So we believe there are multiple different ways of bringing the platforms together, but very importantly, the trust and know where to go and who to start from, I think is the key here. Yeah.
Thank you, Gosia. Slavko, you also mentioned in your presentation that trust was a big problem. What are you doing in Eastern Europe within your client base to try and fix this? It's that good, huh?
GDPR. We're not doing much. I mean, the data is anonymized. I'm afraid that the patients have no access to the results of the analysis, because these are most of the cases scientific analysis. But I can give an example from the COVID pandemic. The military hospital developed an electronic system for collecting administrative and outcomes data for their COVID patients, even with the telemedicine, with getting oximeters and thermometers in patient homes. And the patients were quite motivated to participate in this, because they benefited from this. The doctors also benefited from all this, and the healthcare system of the military hospital as well. I'm not sure about the big companies. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hate to say it, we are almost out of time. So unfortunately, I'm reserved for one final question, and I will go through the panel here. If we had the ability to change one thing, if you could implement one thing right now that could facilitate Eden's use of real-world evidence, whether it be a policy decision, a technology platform, whatever, what would you want it to be? Nicholas, I'll start with you. You've got a magic wand. You have one thing to do that you can implement right now. What's your first point of action?
A full covering system where you can collect data for both outpatient and in-hospital care products, so that we don't see this split and those large white areas that we have today.
That's also GDPR compliant, of course.
Of course it is.
Of course.
By the wand.
Of course. Slavko, from your perspective, what's the one thing, if you could change right now?
Very practical, from a single payer perspective, system outcomes and patient-related outcomes for cancer and rare diseases is a good start.
Thank you. Jacqueline, from your perspective, if you had your magic wand here, what would you change right now?
Well, the beauty, I think, of the common data model and federated approach that we're using within Eden is that it doesn't just enable you to do and run studies, but it also allows you to build tools. So there are a number of existing software tools that have been built on this common data model structure. And what I would really like to see is tools that allow you to do kind of commonly used studies and models that we use in HTA, in HTA type users. So you could think about like easily characterizing survival, plotting survival, or extrapolating data using the standardized tools that allows you to do that really easily in different data sets.
Great, thank you. Anya, from your perspective, what's the one thing you would like to see happen if you could make it happen?
If I could make it happen, I would hope for everybody in Europe to finally decide in which basket they want to put their eggs. Instead of us talking about 15 similar projects here and there financed by all kinds of other resources, we should come up with one project and say, well, this is the one we choose, let's go for it full out.
Focused, large assets, a moonshot, essentially a NASA program for health data. Thank you. Gosha, final word for the patients, obviously, is where it should be. Gosha, from your perspective, what would you like to see happen from the patient perspective?
Well, I would want EHDEN to be more visible and heard, and what they can do to reach out to patient organizations and patients, because there's so much in there that I'm sure we patient organizations and patients can benefit from. It's just the dissemination and the visibility can be increased. That would be my magic touch.
Thank you. Well, we're certainly doing everything we can with webinars like this, and we thank you very much for your presentation. We're also very grateful for the 120 of you who were on today. Obviously, we couldn't get to all your questions. We left a few. We will circulate the remaining questions we had. We had about a dozen of them, and we will circulate them back to the panelists. I would like to thank our panelists for your input. I would like to thank our audience, as well as EHDEN for the opportunity. And with that, I call this webinar closed. Thank you very much, and have a good afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.